Eating 3 meals a day feels natural. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, as if humans had always eaten this way. But for most of history, we didn't. The idea of 3 meals a day isn't ancient. It's industrial. It didn't come from nutrition. It came from work. Factories changed many things, including when we eat. Part 1. Before breakfast. In much of the ancient world, the structure of eating looked very different. In ancient Rome, the main meal was the cena, usually eaten in the late afternoon. Morning eating existed, but it wasn't encouraged. In fact, eating early in the day was often seen as a sign of weak self-discipline. Children and laborers might eat in the morning. Respectable citizens were expected to wait. The physician Galen warned against heavy morning meals. The philosopher Seneca advocated eating only what the body required, a philosophy that becomes significantly easier to follow when someone else is preparing the food. Across much of the ancient Mediterranean, one substantial meal, sometimes two, was enough. The idea that the body needed fuel 3 times a day simply didn't exist. Not because people were different, but because their days were. Part 2. The medieval rhythm. And those days wouldn't change for a very long time. By the Middle Ages, most people still ate twice a day, a smaller meal late in the morning, and a larger one in the evening. The rhythm was shaped by daylight, physical labor, and the rules of the church. Fasting was not a wellness trend. It was a moral obligation. Eating before Mass could even be considered a sin. Even among the aristocracy, where meals became elaborate social events, the structure remained similar. 2 meals were standard. Supper was often little more than bread and ale, which, depending on the ale, may not have felt particularly light. And here is something most people don't realize. The word dinner did not originally mean an evening meal. For centuries, dinner was the main meal of the day, often eaten around midday. What we now call lunch didn't really exist. The word only appeared later, as dinner slowly drifted further into the evening. So the words we use every day, breakfast, lunch, dinner, are not fixed points. They've been quietly rearranged over time. What mattered most was not how often you ate, but how visibly you practiced restraint. And for centuries, that restraint held. Part 3. The industrial clock. Until something came along that made restraint irrelevant. Not science, not preference. Industry. During the 18th and 19th centuries, factory work reorganized daily life. For the first time, millions of people lived by fixed schedules. Shifts began early. Breaks were timed. The day was structured by the clock rather than the sun. Workers needed food before a shift, a pause in the middle of the day, and a meal when they returned home. But even that midday pause was not guaranteed. Early factory workers often had no formal break at all. The right to stop and eat during the workday, something we now take entirely for granted, had to be fought for. It was labor movements, not employers, that secured the lunch hour. The meal break was not a kindness, it was a concession. Gradually, a new rhythm settled into place. Breakfast, lunch, dinner. Not because humans suddenly became hungrier, even though it sometimes feels that way, but because the system required them to function on time. 3 meals a day was not a discovery about human nutrition. It was a byproduct of industrial life. Part 4. The selling of breakfast. And once that rhythm existed, it became something you could sell. In the early 20th century, food companies began building entire industries around the morning meal. John Harvey Kellogg promoted grain-based breakfasts as part of a broader health movement, one rooted as much in moral ideas as in nutrition. Other manufacturers quickly followed. Advertisements insisted the day should begin with a proper meal. By the mid-20th century, a phrase began to circulate: eat breakfast like a king, lunch like a prince, dinner like a pauper. It sounded like ancient wisdom, and happened to be very good for companies selling breakfast. Breakfast is the most important meal of the day. It sounded like medical advice, but it also happened to be extremely effective marketing. cereal, toast, juice, eggs. An entire economy formed around the idea that the morning meal was essential. What had started as a factory schedule had quietly become a cultural rule. Part 5. Loosening. Today, that rule is starting to loosen. Intermittent fasting has returned, not as a religious practice, but as a wellness trend. Remote work has blurred the midday lunch break. In parts of Southern Europe, the main meal still happens in the early afternoon. In other places, meals have always been more fluid. Even the language is shifting. A generation ago, people still distinguished between dinner and supper. That distinction has largely disappeared. A small change, but a reminder that these structures were never as fixed as they feel. And yet the three-meal rhythm persists. In school schedules, in restaurant hours, and sometimes in the quiet feeling of guilt when you skip breakfast, even when nothing actually happens if you do. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, it feels ancient, like something we were always meant to do. But in reality, it's a relatively modern solution to a modern problem. A system built around factories, schedules, and the industrial clock. And like many things we take for granted, it's less a rule of human nature and more a habit of history.